Welcome, everyone. You had just tuned in to the Father Show, and I'm your host, Mike Thompson. And I want to thank you for joining us today. It's fantastic to have you. And today we're going to have a fantastic show as well. So don't go anywhere. Matter of fact, tell somebody else to come join it and watch it as well. But before we start, if you haven't subscribed to the show, I ask that you will click on the subscribe button and go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell. So that way, anytime we upload a show, which is generally every Saturday morning, you will be notified and you don't even have to worry about it. All right. So today we've got a fantastic guest. And we're going to be talking about sobriety for young people and old. And we have a young man here that has been through it, have lived through it. So he's not talking about what he's learned in books and what he's learned at this session, even though he has. But he's also going to be talking about it firsthand. So ladies and gentlemen, I want you to welcome Chris Howard. Chris, how you doing?
You're doing wonderful.
Good, good. Thank you for joining us here on the Father Show today, man. I really appreciate you coming out and providing your expertise in this subject matter.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it and taking the time out to come on the show.
Yeah, good. So why don't you really tell people about you? How did you get into addiction recovery?
I'll give you the amended version for sure. We don't have all day for the show. I could sit here for a couple of days probably, but yeah, no, I have about 12. I've been sober about 12 years. I got sober in April of 2009, and I spent a good decade of doing drugs and alcohol. I grew up in a family system that had serious mental health issues. My mom's was schizoaffective. I spent a lot of my childhood going in and out of psych wards and visiting my mom on psych wards. It wasn't me going into psych wards, but I used to say this a lot. Like I used to think our address out here, they call it the 72-hour psych hold at 5150, and I used to think our address was 5150 because the police were coming out so frequently to kind of pick my mom up and just take her in for stabilization. And so I kind of grew up with like dysfunctional family system. My grandma raised me. She was born in 1919, just a different mentality. So I was able to kind of get away a little bit more with her. And I found quickly, I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, and I had a peer group of friends who were it was like a group of people who were all just like from broken homes, and usually it was like one mom raising a couple kids, and when my mom would go psychotic, I would go stay with one of my other friends' mom, and kind of found like this family system amongst my peers. And I also found drugs and alcohol became a pretty good coping strategy. At first, it was, a lot of fun. I have to say, still to this day, some of the best times I had were probably in my substance abuse. And the truth of the matter is I didn't have much responsibility or anything to worry about either, so I could have, fun with no limitations. And, over time, growing up poor, living off food stamps, having cockroaches, running across me. I think, watching other people sell illicit drugs became something where I was like, hey, like I could eat out every day and not at least feel like I had some sense of glamour in my life. And I started selling drugs, sold drugs for a long time, sold a lot of weed, sold a lot of pills, did all that kind of stuff, and truly believed like that was my calling in life. And thankfully it wasn't, but it was a necessary part of my evolution. And long story short, I had a series of I ended up getting strung out on heroin, and then I went into one treatment. I stayed 30 days, and I'm one of those. I'm a chameleon. I'll fit into any peer group, it doesn't matter, social group, And then I grew up, I think that was, a product of going in and out of foster care too, because I was like, you're from kids who you're not thinking, when you're young, you don't think about race, color, any of this stuff. You're like
Yeah.
kids in a group home and you're like, we got to figure out a way to work together. It's like either
Yeah.
you become psychotic or you develop pretty amazing interpersonal communication skills. And I often look at especially my group home experience, and I wasn't even there that long, a few weeks,
Mm-hmm.
because my grandma got me out of there as fast as she could. And then I ended up in another one. I was there maybe a few more weeks, but I think those experiences were actually something super beneficial for me. And yeah, I ended up, yeah, I'm bounce around, forgive me. But I ended up, strung out on drugs. My house got raided a couple times. I was on a lot of benzos, eating Xanax, and I'd have these seizures. I had 2 seizures in one day. I had a grand mal seizure and my heart stopped.
Mm-hmm.
In jail, totaled cars, did all that stuff. And, kind of just my house ended up getting raided, and it ended up being a weird situation because my mom was getting picked up so frequently. Like the cops who were rookies were now
Mm-hmm.
like sergeants because it had been over the course of like 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And this one cop who knew me as a child, they raided my house, and this one other cop hated me because I kind of had, because of who my mom was mentally ill, they always let me go. I'd get
Okay.
caught with like a quarter ounce of weed, and back then a quarter ounce of weed, you're going to jail. It isn't. This is but
Yeah.
prior to 2000, it's not today where it's like, oh, whatever. What do you mean a quarter ounce of weed? Back then it was,
Drop in
and
the
they let
bucket.
me go. Yeah, totally, totally. And they let me go, but this one cop couldn't stand me. But then his superior, and he was pumped when they caught me. And this one other guy was like, "Listen, I'm not going to be the one to send you to prison. You need to get your shit and get out of here."
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, "Okay." I proceeded to. They left all my drugs. They left all my money. Weirdest situation. I was like, "This is for
Wow.
sure." I almost feel like it was like a thing where they were like letting me know, "We know what's going on. If you don't get out of here, there's going to be bigger problems." And then he literally told me that. I had one friend who was sober. I called him, and I ended up going into this program. It was like a long-term program, and I had no clue what I was signing up for when I got there. Like I was like, yeah, like you go to sober living, and I got there, and they just had a solid community, and like in the house meetings,
Mm-hmm.
guys would be each other's covers, and what I mean by that is they would be like, hey, yo, you say you're gonna do this, and you're not doing it. Like, how they were really trying to help you shape and develop a new set of attitudes, values, beliefs, and behavior.
Yeah. Making sure
That's
you
how
were
I
accountable.
couldn't define it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and high level, and it was peer accountability, which
Yeah.
was different from any
Different. Right.
previous treatment programs and stuff I've been, because it was always counselors. And then when the counselor's gone, you're off with your buddy on the side figuring out how we're going to get booze in this place or whatever it was. So it was just a totally different experience. And my aunt had some money and she paid for 1 month, and then like month 2 came around and she was like, figure it out. And luckily at that point, when I got sober, I think one thing I should say, and I think for people who are trying to get sober, is like I had no intention of staying sober. I was like, I had a grandiose plan up until I had 6 months sobriety, and I was like,
Mm-hmm.
when I get out of here, I want to graduate the program, but I'm going to sell drugs when I leave here. But I'm going to use the drug money to pay for like a really cheap sober living and pay for college. But I know spiritually it doesn't
Hmm.
really weigh out. So what I'm
Wow.
going to do is I'm going to sponsor a lot of people in 12-step program, help them get sober, and even some of my drug dealing customers, I'm going to try to get sober as well too. This is
But
the insanity
but
that was
not
going
you.
on. Yeah, no, I'm not going to be using. I'm just going to be. I'm doing this to nurture my recovery. That was
Hmm.
my ideology at that point. And somewhere around 6 months, I was like, I'm going to end up a loser the rest of my life. And this is coming from someone who, like, for myself, and I'm very disgusted to even say this, but it just is what it is. Like, I wanted to emulate. I felt going to prison was part of my rite of passage into
Yeah.
adulthood. Like, I felt like that was something that needed to happen for
But
me to become a
but
man.
a lot of men, young men especially, feel the same way. That's a rite of passage. They don't look at it in a negative, even though their parents and their grandparents and their relatives all look at it that way. But for them, it's like, okay.
Yeah. one so much is like back to like the peer accountability is because most of their maladaptive behavior is learned in their peer group. For the
Mm-hmm.
most part, people don't learn a lot of this in their family systems. That happens, right? There's gang culture, there's stuff like that. But even the ones who age out of it typically come back to the younger generation and are like, yo, the gang destroyed everything. None of these people care about you. Like, but they can't hear it because
Yeah.
they're not they're 2-3 stages generations removed from it. They have all their wisdom and can't do it. So that was like kind of my ideology. I went through this program, did the year, and then I ended up, I got sober through 12 step. I made amends, and my aunt had paid for 2 treats. She paid for 1 month in that place, and they scholarshiped me the whole year in that program.
Hmm. I didn't even
Um,
realize that there were scholarships available.
yeah. They scholarshiped me the whole time I was there.
Okay.
And to this day at Ethos, I always have at least 1 or 2 people in their scholarship. It
That's
doesn't make
good
a
to know.
difference because Ethos is actually the old program that I went through. It was part of it. It
Okay.
actually transitioned into this. My mentor left the recovery industry and it became Ethos Recovery. So I graduated the program, ran Access. That program was Access for 6 years. My mentor left the business because he saw it becoming more of a business and less about like helping people,
Mm-hmm.
because insurance is like, hey, 90 days, here's what it is. We're like year plus is like to change. There was so much of it centered around like helping change core attitudes, values, beliefs, behavior. And if
Yeah.
someone's been engaging in something for a decade or more, it's not going to happen in 30, 60, 90 days. You know?
Yeah.
So that was kind of like I ended up inheriting, back to real quick, because I'm almost done with this, but I ended up making amends to my aunt. She had paid for that treatment and stuff like that. And she's like, if you want to make amends, I was like, what do I need to do to make right? She's like, go to college. And I was like pissed. I remember calling my sponsor and I was like, I don't want to go to college. Like, da da da. Ended up going to college, ended up having this really fruitful experience, got an education, went to UCLA, graduated from UCLA, ended up becoming a substance abuse counselor maybe a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, something like that, doing case management, stuff like that. And yeah, I was going to go into a master's program, and I ended basically when I had completed college, I was going to go straight into a master's program. And then my mentor was like, "Hey, I'm leaving this industry. You should just kind of take the house and kind of continue on the legacy." And basically, I did that, and that's Ethos came out of it. And now, actually, in 3 weeks, I'm starting the master's program. So,
Okay. Well,
interesting
how
enough,
long have you had Ethos Recovery?
a little over 6 years. A little over
Okay.
6 years. Yeah.
Now, when did you really first get addicted? How old were you?
It's hard to say. I don't like because I'm not like I probably have a bit of a controversial or provocative opinion on addiction, especially
Mm-hmm.
right now because trauma is such a buzzword, and I don't discredit trauma. I think it's a lot of people pushed to the end of their own existence as a result of severe traumatic response. But I believe some
Mm-hmm.
people use drugs because they just love the effect produced by drugs and alcohol. I believe some people use drugs because they lack purpose and have no structure in their life.
Yeah.
So I don't think it, I don't believe it's a one size fits all. And what's happening now
No. And
currently is
I
that.
would agree with you. And I think that with anything, I used to say this with ADHD that that's the new fad. Every kid is ADHD. If you can't control them, ADHD. Just pop them with some pills and sit them in a corner. So I agree with you. It's not a cookie cutter, and I know that some people get into drugs for many different reasons, and a lot of times it's as you mentioned, trauma in the house. You might have been brought up around it, so you just fell into it, expected it. And peer, as you mentioned, the peer pressure. You got those, and so when you look at a young person getting into drugs, and this I want to look at for the parents that have young kids. Can you really tell that your child is starting to use drugs?
I mean, a lot of times it's not always so, black and white, easy to tell.
Yeah.
Usually like just like subtle changes in behavior. What's their sleeping schedule like? What is
Hmm.
the frequency, especially in high school kids? You look at like the frequency in schoolwork, stuff like that, or the truancy. And then there's like the more nonverbal cues. You see maybe people nodding off, loss of weight, um, especially today with marijuana because the THC content is
Hmm.
so high. We're getting
Hmm.
like you're seeing a lot of people who have the genetic predisposition for schizophrenia, basically having full psychotic episodes just from smoking pot. And mind you, 12 years ago when I started doing this, there was when we would get people who would come, we'd get people who come in the program for weed and stuff like that. And there was always kind of like this, whether the counselors would admit it or not, we always had this like, another overbearing parent. You know what I mean? Weed was always viewed as like this, like very trivial, nonchalant, like, it's not, why are this guy's here for weed? Now you got weed guys who are in the program who are worse than the heroin addicts because despite the negative consequences in terms of their own uh, psychological destabilization,
Hmm.
they
Hmm.
continue to persist and pursue it, and they end up in a psych ward, on a 14-day hold. So I think just being mindful of like, subtle differences, paranoia, changes in those behavior are the things you kind of initially need to look out after. And honestly, I'm a big believer in searching your kids' rooms every now and then. You can also most areas you can find a local drug dog agency. You pay them $100 and they'll send a drug dog to your room, to
Oh,
figure stuff out. I'm a big believer of that.
really? So you can actually request a drug dog to come through your house and
Yeah, it's
search.
like a paid, like a concierge essentially service. You pay them like $100, something like that, and
Hmm.
they'll go through your house and search. Hey, are there any drugs here? Or whatever the drug is going to be.
Okay. Now, could you contact, or would you even want to contact your local police officer, K9 unit, and ask them to do it?
They wouldn't do it for sure. They don't have the resources, and number one, like you don't really want to like open the door to like legal.
Right.
I wouldn't want to open the door to legal issues, especially like I honestly don't even think they would do that unless you were like maybe if you're in like some areas where there's like small parishes and like maybe you're friends with the police and like they're
Mm-hmm.
willing to kind of do like a scared straight situation, especially when
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about like adolescents. Like those could be a valuable learning experience where it's like hey, like you need to understand the severity of it. Like the police, are here, and it becomes less about it being some punitive "you're going to jail" thing, and being like, hey, you need to understand the gravity of the situation. You're not an adult. You don't get to make adult decisions until you earn that responsibility. You
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Because, I hear a lot of kids that get into drugs and they think it's okay. And like you mentioned earlier, they think this is going to make them a man, and this is their only recourse, the only way they're going to make money, the only way they're going to get that Porsche or Lamborghini, those fancy items that they would like to purchase. And instead of, we all know, you work at McDonald's, you get $10, $15 an hour, and these
Mm-hmm.
guys can make um, $3,000 a day.
And
Yeah,
it's sometimes an hour. It's like
yeah,
daily.
and some of them an hour. So it's a big difference. Um, Now, some of the preventative? What are some reasons that are preventing people from seeking help for either mental or addiction counseling?
I'd probably say the first number one is access. Financial, it's not. Number one, treatment isn't cheap. County and state funded resources are completely overburdened. Like to get
Hmm.
someone in, I couldn't tell you how many calls I get a week, and just constantly trying to help people access those resources. I also think now I think we're on the beginning of a paradigm shift where
Mm-hmm.
mental health is much more open, and people that the access to those resources are more blatantly aware. People are on TikTok, Instagram, like everywhere, and mental health is kind of like the hotbed topic right now.
Yeah.
So I think it makes it a little bit more easier to access. But even like, today I was on the phone with somebody who couldn't, she was calling a resource who couldn't, like, they didn't even, like, they're not even calling her back, you know?
Mm.
So I think that's like probably the number one obstacle is probably like access to financial resources and just availability.
Now, is there a difference between mental health and addiction? How do they, how can you differentiate between the two? Or
This will be
is
a
there?
controversial topic. It's a controversial topic. In
Yeah.
my opinion, no, I don't. I
Okay.
don't think that. Here's what you know what. Let me backpedal a little bit. There's one difference: is drug addiction and mental health. The difference is the coping strategies for drug addicts is using drugs and alcohol. I don't believe a lot of there's this ideology perpetuated primarily in 12-step culture,
Mm-hmm.
that like, oh, my thought process is my alcoholism, that's my disease, and I don't buy into that. I don't subscribe to that ideology.
Mm-hmm.
The disease is the physical allergy where, like, when I ingest this substance, I have one speed go. I pursue this to the point where to oblivion, right? Uh, to cope with whatever my existence is. And a lot of that existence for most people, I think there's this also thing that's like, oh, it's hard. A lot of the existence is really just boredom. When you talk to drug addicts and alcoholics, their hardest times when they're in treatment is actually when there's just downtime. They have such a hard time dealing with it,
Mm-hmm.
because at least if they're high, they can, feel good.
Yeah. But when you're not, you got to find something to do with your hands and your minds. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That makes sense. Now, with
So,
the ethos recovery, what do you all offer, for somebody that is has an addiction, or what do you guys offer at that ethos recovery?
yeah. So what we have to offer is like much different than what is the current the medical model. We're not a clinical based program. What that means is there's no social workers, there's no psychiatrists, there's no therapists. We are not a clinical model. We're not diagnosing people with anything. What we offer is a social model. We have a community that has an inherent set of attitudes, values, beliefs, behavior. There you go, rites of passage. Oh wait, this side. Rites of passage, healthy lifestyle, self-discipline, personal and social responsibility, and like positive risk-taking behavior. And we have a community where the guys, hold each other accountable and push each other to do that. We don't have like we're not trying to be a clinical model either. We're more trying to create a fraternal community for guys to be open and honest and help them develop healthier coping strategies and healthier masculinity, really, when it comes down to it. Because
Okay.
there's a lot of ideas they play into. It's like, oh, I can't talk about my emotions. I can't be vulnerable. I kind of need to muscle through everything. And the fact of the matter is like there's a part of life where we do really have to muscle through things. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
times where we don't want to get up, we don't want to do things, and that's an important coping strategy to have. And there's times where they or we as human beings need to go, hey, I'm really struggling. Like the solutions I'm coming up with in my brain really aren't working. So I'll call someone, reach out to them, and go, hey, here's this situation. Let me have someone to bounce this off of and kind of come up with a different strategy. So I think, like in terms of having something to offer, it's a peer group that has, a positive value system. And then the philosophy that I come from is like, again, these guys learned all this stuff in their peer group. If they can form significant relationships with the members of this community, their chances of recovery increase dramatically. Over the last 6 years, 65% of the people roughly who go through the program are still sober.
Good.
Which is like an unheard of statistic. The
Yeah.
dropout rate, though, is still very high because most people aren't willing to commit to a year, and we don't
Yeah.
actually ask for a year-long commitment on the front end. We ask for a 90-day commitment because I don't expect someone to buy into something. It almost sounds like a prison sentence, without it knowing anything about it.
Yeah.
Uh, but it's a good house. Teach them how to make food, teach them how to show up, go get a physical. Like these guys, the coping strategies over the past 10 years I've seen people come home with keep getting more and more diminished. And I think obviously there's different social implications, and some of the research out there, seems very provocative in terms of an explanation. But we're really focused on getting these guys to take positive risk-taking behavior because they're good at taking risks when it comes to substance abuse. How do they do socially? These guys are crippled with social fear and anxiety, and they often use drugs and alcohol to cope with that. And the end on this is you can't really blame them because people who don't have substance abuse problems or alcohol problems, whenever
Mm-hmm.
they're at a party, they need a cocktail to take
Mm-hmm.
the edge off, to deal
Mm-hmm.
with the cognitive overload that happens when you're in a social dynamic. And we're like, how do we expose them to as much of that as possible in a safe community to where they can kind of almost be desensitized? I look at sobriety almost as like a superpower for some of these guys who develop the confidence and self-efficacy to move forward.
Yeah. Now you mentioned that it takes a 90, you go in for 90 days, but you really want to there for a year. Why does it take so long?
Well, I mean, there's various different theories on all that, but in terms of just from a behavioral perspective, you have to think of it in the sense like the majority of people coming in, they're using a minimum a year. But most people, it's 5 to 10 years. They're
Mm-hmm.
not just coming into the recovery house or something like that, like off of a bad weekend. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to take that in the context of that's learned behavior. There's literally they talk about cognitive grooving in psychology. The wrinkles we have on our brain are actually learned behaviors. There's a groove, and I always would tell guys, I'd use the analogy. There's a groove dug out in your brain for drug addiction, and
Mm-hmm.
now we're kind of trying to take this and kind of start digging a new groove the other way towards recovery. But it's super hard initially because it's all new learned behavior. It's new coping strategies. And, the reason why it's a long term program is there's a lot of controversy because, people don't like talking about alcoholism as a moral issue. And I don't think it's a moral issue, but there's
Yeah.
morality involved in it, right?
Yeah.
Because you have to, at certain points, regardless whether you're intoxicated or not, you compromise certain aspects of your own integrity, your own morality
Mm-hmm.
to pursue this. So yes, it's not solely a moral issue, but there's values that have shifted within an individual to and you have to look at it from an evolutionary perspective. They've had to change that to survive in their environment.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they've done what they've done. So it's going to take time to ingrain and help them work through because it's often extremely uncomfortable. Like sobriety, getting sober, especially that first 90 days to 6 months, is almost more painful than some of the detox moments when they're coming off the
Really?
drugs because your coping strategies, you're just constantly overwhelmed a lot of times. And that's not everybody, but majority more often than not.
Well, do you think it's part of a man dealing with his own masculinity when he decides that he has a problem or has an addiction or even got into addiction or he feels bad now because he fell into it in a sense? Do you think that plays on his masculinity and when you're going through recovery?
Some of it, I think it's different. I think it's different I think I think the variables have shifted too dramatically in terms of just what the social context of what the country is,
Mm-hmm.
and is it solely? I think for a lot of heterosexual males, that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's the only factor, but I think a lot of it is not feeling like, and that's why I think a lot of it has to do with lack of purpose. They've never, I think it was 85% of the guys that come in the house, the first time they paid a cell phone bill is in our program. Their
Really?
parents have been floating them. Yeah, and we got guys who are 35 years old. 35 years old, never paid a cell phone bill in their life. So you have to imagine what that does to your own self-worth and self-efficacy, living off your parents at that age, because regardless of the stigma and what our perception is of that, like as an individual, like not feeling like you have freedom and autonomy in the world is not really a good feeling for any. That's like male, female, whatever it may be,
Yeah, that's a good point. I never thought of it. But I always wondered about that with men, how they would feel about themselves, because I've seen it. I've seen men that have, they'll come up and they say, well, my mama bought this for me. Or, they're getting ready to travel and my mama bought my ticket, or my mama, like you said, paid my phone bill. And I just looked at it as a mama's boy. You got to grow up and stand on your own 2 feet. And that really, fellas, it has nothing to do with your masculinity. I'm just saying as a individual, because I teach my daughters the same thing, stand up on their own 2 feet. So it's not about that, but it does irritate me when I see grown men that cannot pay their own bill, or can't do for themselves, in a sense. Make a long story.
Yeah, no, and just to piggyback off that real quick, they often feel the same way. The pain, though, at that age of having, this was like one of my main fears of when I was like, granted, I had no one to support me, so I had to figure stuff out, but their fear of actually having to be all in, like you being a man supporting your family, like you've probably just been doing it so long, it's like, well, why are we having this conversation? But for them, it's the scariest thing to be fully responsible for their survival. Not only their survival, but if they end up in it, well, how am I going to manage an intimate relationship? Now I got to support this person. What if we have a kid? What if we have 2 kids? What if we have 3 kids? And then what that does, that's why there's a big thing in recovery. Don't future trip, because they'll go so far down the rabbit hole. They go, you know what, screw this. I'm just going to go get loaded, And I think also, like, just from the societal change, real quick, just to piggyback off that, like, there has been a shift too. Is like it's a bad thing to tell someone to, quote unquote, man up. That's perceived in a very negative connotation. And the fact of the matter is in life, male, female, you're going to have to man up. You're going to have to woman up. There's going to be times in life, especially if you have kids. If you have kids, it doesn't, hey, you know what? The kid's sick. You're sick. Hey, if I don't go to work today, there's no food on the table. That's the truth. It doesn't matter how sick you are. It doesn't, pandemic shows up. You got to figure something out. You have to. You have it, and that means even if you've got to drive to every shelter across the county to get food, whatever it may be. And it's hard. Life in general, I was talking to a really prominent trauma therapist out here. What we're saying is life is a series of paper cuts. These little traumas, they call them now, because there's big T trauma and little T trauma. My whole thing is life is traumatic, and we have to go, hey, where are some of these learning opportunities for growth? Because for me, my most traumatic incident in my life, i.e. being in the group home, pulled out of school, taken from my mom, like it was not, like, I'm not going to pretend like when I was going through it, it was great. I was crying, I was like, engaging in like prayer behavior I had never engaged in as an 8-year-old. Like it was hard, but in hindsight, looking back on it, probably the best thing that ever happened to me.
Okay.
Because because I just can communicate with people. I can relate with other people. I can be thrown in awkward social context and kind of figure out my way relatively effortlessly to than some people. It's just easier, So, sorry, I'm long-winded.
No, that's all right. I don't mind that. So with the, that's about our time for the day, but with the Ethos House or Ethos Recovery, what would you tell? Well, before we get to that, what advice would you give a man that's struggling with an addiction?
My advice would be, and I'm not. It's not that I think 12 steps the only way. My thing about 12 step is 12 steps free, and what its real purpose is to help you. You read in the back of it, it talks about a spiritual experience, and there's a lot of people who misrepresent what it is. But it
Mm-hmm.
says in the print, a spiritual experience is a personality change sufficient enough to bring about recovery, and what you need with that is open-mindedness, honesty, and willingness. So I believe that, hey, even at 12 step, there's smart recovery, there's refuge recovery, whatever. You need to surround yourself with, you need to abandon everything else that's around you, in my opinion. Your social group, all that stuff. And listen, your social group could actually be people who don't even support your addiction. That's not what
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying. Like, there's
Mm-hmm.
good people in a lot of people's life who have substance abuse. You need to surround yourself with people who are kind of going through this process, or today you can go on TikTok, follow people, whatever it may be, but also be around people who can help guide you away from that system, and be willing to do, again, right there. Where is it? I always go wrong side. Positive risk taking behavior. That's my thing. I think positive risk taking behavior, because it's always talked about in a negative connotation, is getting out into social dynamics, maybe trying therapy. A lot of people don't want to do therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Stuff where you can start to expose yourself to whatever you feel is like stressing you out. If you feel like you're too stressed to do it, my mentality is lean further into it, and that's not swimming with alligators. That's like, I don't want to go back to school. I don't want to go back to school, but I go, there's a structure and there's an added value that I know I'll get, and one I probably don't even see, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So if you remain open-minded, you can have an experience that you don't even know you could actually have, because you
Okay.
haven't had the experience.
And you do interventions as well, right?
Yes, I do interventions. I have
Okay.
pretty much my whole recovery.
So yeah, so anybody that needs to get in touch with you in regards to say they need to do an intervention to a family member or a friend, they can contact the Ethos House or Recovery. I keep saying the Ethos House because that's what I read, so I kept going over in
Yeah.
my head. Now I see
No, it's
recovery.
Ethos House. It is Ethos House. Ethos House, or ethosrecovery.com. And then my personal website is lifestyleinterventions.com, mainly because I believe it's a lifestyle change. Like, you going into a 30, 60, 90-day treatment program isn't, it's just like, it's stabilization. That's what's happening there.
Yeah.
And to engage in a lifestyle change means ingraining habits and mindset for change.
Okay. And so everything that they need to know is on the website, and they can get there and reach out. And you're based out in California, or you
Yeah,
nationwide?
Los Angeles, California. I mean, we have people coming from nationwide because
Yeah.
we're in home recovery, and I've done interventions, all over. So,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Well, Chris, man, it's been great to have you on the show, and really brought some great information, for fathers that might be going through it, men might be going through it, and even parents for that matter. Because I know a lot of time, unfortunately, like you mentioned kids get involved in it, and I'm not gonna sit up there and try to play innocent because I was like you. I sold marijuana when I was in high school, later part of high school and college. But so I'm not gonna sit up there and say I don't know what it's like. But I don't know what you experience, and I really appreciate you coming out and sharing your experience and sharing your story and what you've had to gone through in your lifetime and how you have overcome all that and being the man that you are today. So I really applaud you and I thank you for doing what you're doing.
And I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to come out here and share my experience. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, that's our show for today. And ladies and gentlemen, I really do thank Chris Howard for coming out, because that is some great information and something that I know as parents, we sometimes need to find out about it. And because your kid might be going through it and you don't know where to take them, what's out there is available. But now you have Chris Howard and the ETHOS Recovery. They're there and you can get their information. And I hope I'm going to try to get Chris to get that information on our website so you can find it there as well. But if you haven't, I want you to go ahead and subscribe to our show and click that notification bell so that way you're always hear about the new show when we launch it on Saturdays. And also, if you don't have the time to watch it, on video, you can listen to the show on iHeartRadio, Stitcher, TuneIn, Pandora, Spotify, and other apps. So you can take your time, listen to it whenever you're convenient for you. Okay. So I want to thank you for joining us today on the Father Show. Once again, I'm your host, Mike Thompson, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.